I hope everyone's had lunch and their coffee afterwards. We're going to get started again. The second panel of this conference is titled Minorities in Limbo. And I'm going to introduce our speakers before they speak. And our first speaker is Franck Salameh. Professor Salameh is a professor of Near Eastern Studies in the chair of the Department of Slavic and Eastern Languages at Boston College. His fields of specialization are contemporary Middle Eastern history and the history of ideas and political thought in the Levant. His two most recent books are The Other Middle East, an anthology of modern Levantine literature, which was published in 2018, and more recently, Lebanon's Jewish Community, Fragments of an Arrested.
Lives arrested.
Oh, okay. Of arrested lives or lives arrested. And I have to say that for those who haven't seen the cover of the new book, it's one of the most beautifully decorated covers I've seen of a recently published book.
And it hides the defects of the content.
And if the contents are as beautiful as the cover, I'm sure it would be worth your time, well worth your time. Professor Salameh is going to speak today about Near Eastern Christians, cultural intermediaries, or coal mine canaries. Professor Salameh.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Efrat, especially. Congratulations to Professor Benjo on the new book. As we say where I come from, Mabruk, or Bricho, which is Mazel Tov. I'm happy that the panel this morning gave you the bad news, so I'm left with the easy task of giving you the good news. During the weeks between September 29th and October 12th, 2008, 15 young Christians were murdered in cold blood on the streets of Mosul. A manhunt ensued. None of the offenders were ever identified or apprehended. And with impunity, killings continued into the present in Iraq, in Egypt, and elsewhere, wherever Near Eastern Christians came into view. As put by a French historian, Sébastien de Courtois, who works on the Assyrians for centuries now, the cross has been trampled in the dust of Abraham. The destruction of Eastern Christendom is an order of things that raises no eyebrows. It is hardly a novelty. The deliberate, methodical dispossession and outright erasure of the histories, languages, cultures, and memories of indigenous non-Muslim Middle Easterners is a saga 14 centuries in the making. Yet normative Middle East studies, Middle Eastern scholarship, and legacy Middle East punditry praise themselves often for always identifying the usual, the same usual suspects, namely economic hardships and a vexing Arab-Israeli conflict that rankles even the wary, always conveniently sidestepping the root cause of the plight, the main drive behind the looming disappearance of Near Eastern Christians. Still, in a millennial attempt at clinging to their tenuous existence in an often hostile environment in their historical homelands, no less, Near Eastern Christians have always aimed at preserving their identity, at persevering, at casting themselves as cultural intermediaries, as hyphens and bridges, as it were, between East and West, transmitting to the Western world the faintest pulsations of the Eastern and Arab worlds, intercepting before anyone else the life ripples of the Mediterranean, Europe, and the universe, and retransmitting them to the nations of the hinterland, to those realms of sands and sleepy mosques. These are not my words, those are words of Lebanese Druze chieftain Kamal Jumblat from 1945, a Lebanese politician who wasn't necessarily sympathetic to Christian causes or Near Eastern Christians or their plight. Indeed, he argued that it is Near Eastern Christians who make the Near Eastern Mosaic a mosaic. Without them, and I'm paraphrasing here, there is only a Middle East of blandness and slumbers and old shrines. Still, in the telling of Kamal Jumblat, staid, austere, traditional, and rigidly ordered, the Middle East slumps in stark contrast to the dynamism, the edginess, the fluidity, and the intellectual audacity practiced by Levantine Christians, this unique breed of polyglot, cosmopolitan, cultural intermediaries. Indeed, the radiance of Greece and Rome, the splendor of Constantinople and Alexandria in old times, the church fathers themselves, from Ephraim the Syrian to Cyprian of Carthage to Clement and Augustine and Ignatius. This is not to mention the Jewish founders of Christianity themselves. All of those are Near Eastern bequests, not Western bequests. Just as Europe today may be unthinkable without Paris, so would the diversity and flexibility and moral elegance of the Eastern Mediterranean be unthinkable today without the region's enterprising minority peoples, Christians, Jews, and others, but especially Christians for our purposes today because, in my view, they are the community that is on the verge of extinction in our time. Under early Islam, spanning the 7th to the 10th centuries, Christian monasteries radiated a unique indigenous kind of polyglossia, maintaining a fervid movement of translation and diffusion of the scientific and philosophical traditions of classical antiquity. Indeed, long into the second millennium of the Christian era, the big picture, linguistically and culturally and intellectually speaking, had been one of a congenital Christian bilingualism and multilingualism even, a feature that is still a Near Eastern fixture and a mode of being in our times. And so, in addition to countless varieties of Arabic brought along with the 7th century Muslim colonizers, pockets of Aramaic, Hebrew, Coptic, and Greek speech communities survive to this day in parts of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and elsewhere. It is precisely this distinct Near Eastern Christian phenomenon that made the intellectual radiance of 9th century Abbasid Baghdad possible, a world of Islam that had become heir to Greco-Roman traditions precisely through the conduit of non-Muslims and non-Arabs, Middle East Christians in particular. And so, when one speaks of an Arab-Islamic period of intellectual effervescence and transmission during the golden age of Islam, one is speaking most probably of an enterprise that would have been impossible without Syriac Christians, without Jews, without Indians and Persians, but especially, again, without Near Eastern Christians. Byzantium never forgot, famously wrote French historian Sylvain Guggenheim, noting that Near Eastern Christians were instrumental in the preservation and diffusion from east to west of the scientific and philosophical corpus of classical antiquity, which was essentially, in many ways, their corpus. Even today, our modern world's most notable universal and humanistic of human endeavors may likewise be attributed to the impulses and sensitivity of Near Eastern minority peoples. All humans are born free and equal with dignity and rights, read the first sentence of the preamble of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All humans, quote, are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, further claimed this now universal document. Likewise, its Article 18 stressed that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change one's religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest one's religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance, end quote. It's not far-fetched imagining the authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Israel's Abba Ibn and Lebanon's Charles Malik, it's not hard imagining them having had Near Eastern minorities in mind when they produced that famous document's central theme some 70 years ago. Malik himself had written about this about 35 years later in 1980, affirming that, quote, "The future does not belong to oppression but to liberation. The future will not bring about a contraction of existing freedom but a widening of its scope. The future will not conduce to the enlargement and grounding of slavery but to diminishing its sway and getting rid of it altogether. The future does not belong to discriminating against the religious minorities, but to these minorities themselves winning complete equality in their responsibilities, rights, and obligations. The future does not belong to the realm of darkness, but to the realm of light, which shone and continues to shine in Lebanon." End quote. It's eerie to reread these words, these confident words of Malik some 40 years later, not from his Lebanese perch, but from a nearness out of reach, gazing at a deformation, essentially deformation of the Lebanon that Malik idealized, which had become not a realm of light as he had hoped, but a world of twilight, impenetrable darkness. Yet Malik's and Ibn's were principles upheld and flaunted vociferously by Eastern Christians and Jews since at least the coming of Islam in the 7th century, and for our purposes since the dawn of the age of liberalism in the late 18th century Middle East. But this role assigned to Near Eastern minorities, that of cultural intermediaries and healers and mediators, if you will, buying them time in an increasingly shrinking space for pluralism, this role seems to have outlived its utility. Indeed, Near Eastern Christians, an indigenous, I don't like to use the words, but that's what they really are. They are the indigenous people of the Near East, seem to have become one people too many in a Middle East that is today taken to be unitary, uniform, homogeneous Muslim Arab. The numbers, despite the lack of reliable censuses, do bear out the reality of a looming historical calamity. There is a sense of an impending fin de race among Near Eastern Christians, noted the doyen of Lebanese historians, Kamal Salibi. Although a doyen of Lebanese historians, he was not particularly, throughout his career, he wasn't particularly sensitive to the plight of Near Eastern Christians. Yet by the turn of the century, by 2001, he had already begun admitting the obvious, that the collapse of Near Eastern Christian history was very near at hand, that after 14 centuries of having been Islam's exemplars of affability and originality and innovation and reconciliation, a sense of exhaustion is finally setting in among them. They are too Christian in a space where pluralism is in decline, where religious extremism oppresses and kills, and where the world assents, appeases, submits, and looks the other way. Near Eastern Christians tend to be intelligent, well-qualified, highly educated, noted Salibi, but now they're simply opting to take their skill sets to more hospitable climes. It's a very serious matter, he stressed, because each time a Near Eastern Christian leaves, no other Christian comes to fill his space. And that's detrimental to the Middle Eastern mosaic. Again, it is the Christians who keep the Middle East a Middle Eastern mosaic rather than a monolithic Muslim world, concluded Salibi. But the die has been cast. In 1920, there were close to 3 million Christians in what is today Turkey. That number has dwindled to barely 300,000 in our time. That is to say, it dipped from about 25% of the population to barely 5% of the population today. In the main, those are elderlies and peoples who essentially cannot travel, cannot leave, and live a devalued existence at the edge of extinction. In 1952, when Jamal Abdel Nasser came to power in Egypt, there were almost 500,000 Egyptian Christians other than Copts in what is now the Arab Republic of Egypt. Today, following Nasser's liquidation of Egypt's age of cosmopolitanism, non-Coptic Christians are non-extant in the land that once called St. Mark the Evangelist its patron saint. Even the ancient Copts themselves, a group that is not used to immigrating. The Copts are among the few Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, North African Christian communities that did not imitate their Levantine counterparts by immigrating. They have begun the path of sort of exile. And who is not familiar with my people, the Maronites, their disorientation in today's Lebanon, a community that, for all intents and purposes, invented modern Lebanon, spawning its new republic as a federation of minorities, if you will, but first and foremost as a haven for persecuted Near Eastern Christians. The Maronites who, in the words of one historian, the Maronites who traveled through history with dignity, who through 14 centuries of existence in an Islamized Levant never lived as dhimmis, and indeed for some time even exacted tribute from the walis of Damascus, they are now relegated to abject dhimmitude, divested of their historical, cultural, and political relevance, and demoted to a position of servility, a servitude whereby Christians live but are barely alive. With the preceding in mind, it may be imperative to recognize that the plight of Near Eastern Christians perhaps needs to be looked at separately from all other problems plaguing the Near and Middle East, that their troubled present days be viewed not as a reaction nor as an emanation of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but as a plight with its own distinct history. Indeed, the plight of Near Eastern Christians is the sequel, perhaps even the culmination of a long process of squeezing out that had begun with the 7th century Muslim conquest of the Near and Middle East, and that for a while had stopped at the foot of the Lebanon mountains. But that pause, which might have lasted some 14 centuries, seems possessed of a new kind of dynamism in this 21st century. Lebanon is now also being swept away in the tide of ascending religiosity and rising Islamic zeal. And there is clearly a prevailing hierarchy in reporting on the flight and the plight of Near Eastern Christians. Some victims in the conflicts of the Middle East do get airtime all the time. The Christians' disappearance has been referred to also by Sébastien de Courtois as the silent exodus. Sometimes he refers to it as the silent genocide. But I would like to end with a longish kind of quote to tell you that there is awareness among the dominant ethnos, if you will, or the intellectual class among the dominant ethnos, and that is, what is commonly referred to as the Muslims or the Arabs of the Muslim Arab world, who are calling to task Arabs and Muslims to stop this bleeding, this squeezing out of Near Eastern Christians. In a July 21st, 2014 op-ed in the Kuwaiti Al-Qabas, Ahmad al-Sarraf issued his own indictment of his own people in a combustive, tongue-in-cheek kind of an op-ed, which he titled "Begone, Christians." He wrote facetiously in a diatribe at the time lampooning the ISIS playbook. He noted that Muslims could not care less that Near Eastern Christians may be the indigenous people of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine. He demanded that they still be expelled anyway, quote, so that Muslims would no longer be put to shame when their eyes meet the searching gaze of Christians wondering what had gone wrong with Islam. Yes, he said, be gone already, and take away with you your mercy. For with al-Nusra and ISIS and al-Qaeda and the rest of them on our side, the gangs of Muslim brothers and their latest, finest products are a we are scarcely in need of the Christian's mercy and compassion. So let the bloodletting commence, let the violence reign supreme, let the hearts get ripped out of their chest cavities, and let human livers get eaten raw. Let the tongues be torn out, let the necks get hacked off, let the knees get shattered, for we shall eagerly return to the medicine of old, to our herbal remedies and our old books of alchemy and witchcraft. Yes, be gone, O Christians, and leave us be to our desert creed, for we crave the glint of our swords, the heat of our sands, and the energy of our mules. We scarcely need you, your civilization, and your scientific and literary contributions, for we have our own capital in abundance, our own gangs of murderers and bloodthirsty butchers and executioners. Scram, you Christians, and spare us your civilization. We are replacing your culture with that of the grave diggers. Now, that op-ed is relatively recent, 2014, but I argue that its content is symptomatic of a long-standing epidemic that has for 14 centuries pitted the young of the children of Abraham against their elders. And so perhaps before it's too late, the pendulum of the world's outrage may swing in favor of Near Eastern Christians, or maybe in Luke, the evangelist's words, if the world opts to remain silent, the stones may cry out. But until then, the latest chapter in the saga of destruction of Near Eastern Christendom goes unabated, and Assyrians, Chaldeans, Copts, Maronites, Armenians, and others, precious few remaining specimens of the world's oldest civilizations, quietly shuffle into extinction in mournful anonymity and oblivion, and their homelands turned into empty spiritual Disneylands. Thank you.